Resident Evil 4 was one of the most accomplished remakes of 2023, a modernized, bold reinterpretation of Capcom's 2005 action horror classic. It looked great too, across current-gen platforms as well as PS4, with intricate lighting detail and excellent art design. There were some configuration hangups on consoles, but for the most part it was an attractive title. As the year closes out, Capcom has delivered RE4's first mobile port. As a part of Apple's recent AAA gaming push, Resident Evil 4 is now available on iPhone 15 Pro and M1 and M2 based iPads. So is the game hung up on performance and configuration issues, like Resident Evil Village? Or is RE4 a capable conversion of the console code? Resident Evil 4 was for the most part a current-gen console and PC experience, but Capcom also shipped the game on PS4 console systems. The visuals were mostly preserved on Sony's 8th-gen machines, but there were some notable cutbacks. Most notably, texture resolution took a big hit, and texture streaming could be pretty slow. There were a range of lighting cutbacks as well, including a reduction in the number of shadow casting light sources, and absent screen space reflections. Those cutbacks need to be kept in mind because the PS4 code proves the closest match of the console versions for the results we see on the iPhone. Unlike Resident Evil Village on iPhone, RE4 doesn't have a PC-style settings menu, so we're effectively getting one basic visual experience on the platform, with some options to adjust lens distortion, depth of field, and motion blur, like we saw on all console versions of the game. For these comparisons, I've opted to keep lens distortion off and the other visual modifiers on. The first thing that should stand out here is that the iPhone version has a very obvious blue tint for some reason. It's also much darker than the PS4 version with the default brightness, so I've pushed brightness to roughly the same level as the PS4 through the options menu for these comparisons. I'd recommend anyone else playing the game in SDR do the same. Texture art does look pretty similar for the most part between the two versions. If you look closely though, the iPhone code does feature some noticeably lower res texture art through a lot of the game's environments. These aren't huge differences, but the world just looks a bit blurrier and less well defined in general. Curiously, we see a lot of the same issues with texture loading that we saw in PS4, despite the iPhone's much faster storage. When we approach the rock face here, it takes almost exactly the same amount of time to load in the higher res asset on both platforms. Looking through the environment, we do see some reductions in level of detail settings between the PS4 and iOS versions. This is most noticeable on smaller incidental objects like these sand eggs, which have a noticeably squared off appearance on the iPhone. There are also some very obvious reductions in foliage density, which is quite clear on the ground here. Tree lines look pretty similar, but patches of grass and bushes are less thick on the iPhone than PS4. A lot of the lighting is pretty similar across the two games. Primarily, this is related to how the lighting in RE4 works in general, as it features a lot of baked lighting that translates about the same across the two platforms. The PS4 specific concessions return here too, like how this light source doesn't cast a shadow behind Leon. Screen space reflections are also absent, although as those familiar with the RE Engine SSR can attest, this is probably a good thing for the game's visuals overall. On the plus side, volumetrics do return here, though resolution has taken a small hit relative to the PS4. If we look at the shadows for a moment, the actual shadow resolution in most scenes isn't particularly impressive, though a quick glance at the PS4 code reveals very similar shadow resolution on that platform. The primary issue here, I think, is the dither pattern that's used to give an impression of shadow softness. On PS4, it looks acceptably fine-grained, but on iPhone, it looks very coarse and unconvincing. I think this may be related to the very low internal resolution of the iPhone version, which we'll touch on in a few moments. Post-processing also takes a hit. Looking through some of the more action-packed cutscene sequences, the motion blur looks rough and sort of undersampled at times, though I think again that this may be related to the lower internal resolution on iPhone. Depth of field isn't as obvious and can exhibit some nasty artifacts around character edges. These effects don't really carry the same cinematic flair that we see on the PS4, though I think on the smaller iPhone screen they mostly look okay. So in terms of general visual settings, the iPhone code measures up just fine relative to PS4. It's not offering the exact same visual experience as we'd see on console, but you are getting similar enough underlying settings that it still looks very much like Resident Evil 4. This is far better than what you'd expect from a Switch port of this game, for instance. Image quality is probably the biggest sore spot though. The PS4 code, for its part, looks pretty good, with a 900p image combined with TAA for a fairly smooth and detailed final resolve. By last-gen standards, image quality is perfectly reasonable on that platform. The iPhone just doesn't hold up well by comparison. The game tends to have a lot of these sort of salt and pepper disocclusion artifacts all over the screen at times. Almost any time there's substantial movement in the frame, these issues will be noticeable, especially around Leon's hair and in foliage elements. These problems seem to be caused by a very low internal resolution combined with Apple's Metal FX temporal upscaler. I counted a resolution of roughly 300p across several shots, which I suspect is being upscaled to something in the region of 720p using Metal FX's machine learning based temporal upscaler. If we go back to Resident Evil Village on iPhone, we can observe a lot of the same kinds of image breakup when we move back and forth here with that Metal FX upscaler enabled. It's just less obvious in Village because of the first-person camera and because there's less foliage in Village. To be fair, in still shots, the game's image coheres surprisingly well for a game that operates at these kinds of internal resolutions. Interior areas fare best, without much pesky alpha to mess up the Metal FX resolve. Considering the performance savings and the smaller iPhone screen used to navigate the game, I don't really think this is that bad of a solution, though it would have been better to combine Metal FX with higher resolutions to get a truly stable and consistently good-looking final result. Upsampling solutions just don't tend to work well when they have to work with so few pixels. So how does performance fare in Resident Evil 4 on iPhone? Technically speaking, we're mostly looking at a 30fps update here. Throughout typical combat and exploration, the game does hit 30fps generally speaking, but there are some pretty big issues. Firstly, frame pacing is incorrect, like in a lot of 30fps iOS games. It's not horrible here. Resident Evil 4 fluctuates between 33 and 16 milliseconds every so often, with a steady beat of 33 millisecond frames in between. It's annoying but not a deal breaker, but there are some occasional very heavy framerate drops that seem to come out of nowhere, where the game becomes a bit of a slideshow for a few seconds. These aren't terribly frequent, occurring maybe once every 5 or 10 minutes, but they do bring you out of the experience. I also noticed a couple of lengthy stutters during my gameplay, and there are some more conventional performance problems as well, as the game struggles to maintain its 30fps target in some moments. The frame times aren't wildly out of bounds here, so the game is just on the edge of maintaining 30fps and just can't quite get there. Resident Evil 4 isn't a great performer by any means, but it does fare quite a bit better than Resident Evil Village on iPhone. That title suffered from prolonged framerate dives during typical gameplay, even when running on the lowest settings, and these problems haven't been addressed at all in subsequent patches, as the footage you're seeing here is from the most recent update. For reference, the PS4 release ran Resident Evil 4 with an unlocked framerate that ran from 30 to 60 FPS in typical play. It wasn't ideal, but it does feel smoother than the iPhone code here, and its frame times tend to be more under control than the iPhone. PS4 did use reduced rate animation on enemy characters when facing large groups of foes, however, a concession that the iPhone doesn't employ. Loading times are another win for Apple's smartphone. A load that takes roughly 40 seconds on PS4 completes in just 7 seconds or so on iPhone, a gain probably attributable to the iPhone's advanced CPU and fast flash storage. On mobile platforms, every second counts, and the iPhone generally fares quite well when loading saves in RE4. The controls are a bit of a mixed bag. On the plus side, the game supports both Xbox Series and PS5 pads without issue, and there's even a toggle to swap button layouts between the PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo styles. Rumble works fine, and all the buttons function normally. Input lag is an issue though. I measured about 200 milliseconds input lag here when connected to this Bluetooth sliding controller, and the game has a pretty heavy feel in general. It's not unplayable, but it never really feels responsive. I'd recommend against trying to play this game without a gamepad though, because the touch controls are very bare bones. The game just presents every single button on the screen at all times, which makes it pretty tough to control. The best adapted iPhone games use context-sensitive controls, like the GTA Definitive Editions, with buttons only popping up as needed or serving a combined purpose depending on the situation. Simply overlaying a modern gamepad layout across the majority of the screen is not a particularly effective solution. Resident Evil 4 on iPhone is definitely an improvement over RE Village. We don't have to fiddle around with complex and crash-inducing visual settings, and the game actually runs sort of okay, with a somewhat unsteady but reasonably performant 30 FPS update. This is a better configured game than Village, and Village's unique performance gremlins don't seem present here, but I think expectations for Apple's AAA gaming push are a bit higher. Outside of the 3 games I've reviewed recently on iPhone, RE Village, the GTA Definitive Editions, and of course RE4, there's not too much like this game on iOS. Visually speaking, the closest other title I've played might be Wreckfest, a last-gen racer that can hit 60 FPS on iPhone 15 Pro, or Genshin Impact. But accepting those games, the most sophisticated iPhone software is roughly at a 360 or PS3 level of basic visual fidelity or below, so it's hard to judge exactly what we should expect from a title like RE4 that essentially amounts to a full-fledged PS4 port. I'm inclined to think that a closer 30 FPS lock should be at least achievable in these kinds of games, while maintaining decent image quality and settings. Upcoming Apple Silicon titles, most notably Death Stranding and Assassin's Creed Mirage, will put this to the test, and I hope we will see a truly polished last-gen iOS port in 2024. But so far the results have been more mixed, with better results on the visual front than in performance. Resident Evil 4 is at least good enough that I think it makes for a reasonable mobile experience, as long as you keep hopes in check. You'll have to tolerate substantial performance issues and a sometimes messy image, but this is still Resident Evil 4 on the go, and it looks decent and doesn't crash. It just lacks the performance and visual consistency that a lot of players will expect. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, use social media. Thanks for watching.